go ahead and hit the record button.
Okay, got it. Good.
So you're good to go whenever you're ready.
Welcome to All Souls Forum. I'm Spencer Graves, a member of the Forum Committee at All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church here in Kansas City. Since 1943, this forum has provided a platform for important conversations to promote critical thinking on the most compelling and challenging issues of our day, especially those that involve ethical values in the contemporary world. Today, Dean Baker will discuss the economics of infectious diseases. Baker is a co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and a visiting professor at the University of Utah. He also published a book in 2016 entitled Rigged: How Globalization and the Rules of the Modern Economy Were Structured to Make the Rich Richer. A web search for Baker Rigged gave me a website where you can get that book for free in PDF or purchase it from Amazon. I mention that because that book and a previous interview I did with Professor Baker were part of the inspiration for a paper I wrote on today's topic entitled Externalities, Public Goods, and Infectious Diseases, which appeared in the most recent issue of Real World Economics Review. Professor Baker?
Okay, thanks, Spencer. I appreciate the chance to talk to everyone. So thanks for arranging this, and I hope folks find this worthwhile. So let me see if I could set this up properly. Share screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I want to make three main points in talking about the economics of infectious diseases. First, I want to talk about economics of drug and vaccine development in general, because I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion on it, and I think part of that's deliberate. I mean, it's not a secret that the pharmaceutical industry is very big and powerful, and to my view, at least, I think they benefit from the confusion, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then specific features of infectious diseases. So why are infectious diseases different from, say, heart disease or cancer? That in many ways seems very obvious, but in the pandemic, we had a lot of people posing this as serious questions that, you know, we don't tell people how they should treat their heart disease. I mean, we might tell them, but we don't try to, the government doesn't try to force them in any way. And of course, the point is with infectious diseases, you know, you can catch them. I can't catch your heart disease. You can't catch my heart disease. And lastly, a little bit about the policy responses. And again, the issue with policy responses to infectious diseases, because infectious diseases are not new. The policy responses are not new, but again, it's sort of like we have to redo the history as though we're all starting from scratch, or at least that's the way it often felt as we were combating the pandemic. Okay, the first point about the economics of drug and vaccine development. Drugs are cheap. I often give talks and I'll say drugs are cheap, and people look at me like I'm a moron. No, I know drug companies charge a lot for drugs, so that's of course true. So many drugs are very, very expensive. Insulin can be hundreds of dollars a month. Other drugs, new cancer drugs, sometimes hundreds of thousands for a year's treatment. Those are not cheap. What I mean when I say they're cheap, it's almost always actually cheap to manufacture and distribute a drug. So the point here is that when we're looking at, okay, even the most expensive drugs, the newest cancer drugs, odds are to actually manufacture and distribute those drugs, it most likely only cost a few thousand, and again, very often much less than that. There was a famous, important drug, Sovaldi, a breakthrough drug for treating hepatitis C, and Gilead Sciences, the manufacturer, was selling for $84,000 for a 3-month course of treatment. I think it was 12 pills, if I remember right. Anyhow, there were generics in India of the same drug available for a few $100s for a 3-month course of treatment, and these were good drugs. I mean, India's generic industry produces at the highest quality. They're sold all over the world. They're sold here. So it's not that you're getting some fly-by-night back alley drugs. You were getting top quality drugs. So the point here is that it's very, very rare that you have a drug that's actually expensive to manufacture and distribute. Or for that to be the case, I couldn't identify one. Someone may know of one, but you'd have to have like something that was really rare, a substance that you could only get from some rare plant in the Amazon or something like that. I mean, that's what it would take for it to be expensive to manufacture and distribute. I mean, some of them, sometimes you have to keep something very cold. You know, we know that with the vaccines, you know, so that raises the cost. But even then, it's still, you know, it's nothing like what we charge, what drug companies charge for these drugs. So why are drugs expensive? Well, that's because we give drug companies patent monopolies. So the logic here is that a drug company has a cancer drug that may extend your life, may save your life, and they're the only ones who could produce it. I would get arrested. A generic competitor would get arrested if they were to produce in competition. Government gave them a monopoly. I make this point because it's not the market. I mean, it's, you know, it's people often say, oh, we should let the free market. Well, there aren't government granted patent monopolies in a free market. So in a free market, drugs are cheap. They become very expensive because we give drug companies patent monopolies. And just in case we have any lawyers there, no, I would not literally be arrested for violating a patent monopoly. I've had people get very upset at me for saying that. So if we want to go through that, what that would mean is that suppose I have my generic drug company and I'm making this patent cancer drug, and they have a clear case. I'm violating the patent. They go to court. They get an injunction. They tell me to stop making it. I keep making it. Well, then I get arrested for violating the injunction. So I'm not literally getting arrested for violating the patent monopoly. I'm getting arrested for violating the injunction. So anyone who wants to be a stickler about the way the laws work, no, you don't get arrested for violating a patent monopoly. Okay, but there is a logic. You know, the drug companies go, well, we spent all this money to develop the drug. And there is some truth to that. They exaggerate. You know, I've looked over the research that they cite and everything. I won't go into any detail on that. They exaggerate, but there's no doubt about it. I mean, Pfizer, Merck, Moderna, in the case of the mRNA vaccine for COVID, they spend money to innovate, to develop drugs. And it's not cheap. I don't mean to say that, but it's they could exaggerate it, but there's no doubt about it. They spend money. And the logic of a patent monopoly is if you let, you know, if you said Pfizer, whoever, Johnson & Johnson, whoever it might be, go ahead, develop drugs, but then as soon as they're developed, anyone could just go, okay, well, we'll reverse engineer that and we'll start to produce that at, you know, 1/10 or 100th the price in many cases, again, going to the generic producers in India. Well, in that case, they would never be able to recover their research costs. So again, drug companies are in business to make a profit. So if they couldn't recover their research costs, then they're not going to do research. They're not going to develop new drugs. Okay, so that's clearly true. I mean, you need to give them an incentive. And if they didn't have patent monopolies, at least in the current system, they would not have an incentive to spend large amounts of money developing new drugs. Okay, but the point, and again, I won't go into great detail here, but we often get into this story where this is the only way, patent monopolies are the only way to finance the development of new drugs. And I just make the point here that it's just not true. There's nothing magic about patent monopolies. I mean, that's one way to finance innovation, but we do have other mechanisms, and this isn't communism. This is the United States of America. We have the National Institutes of Health. We give the National Institutes of Health over $50 billion a year to do biomedical research. And there are other government agencies. CDC supports some research. We have BARDA, don't ask me what it stands for, Biological Advanced Research Development Agency. I think that's it. Anyhow, we have BARDA that also is a few billion. Point just being that we spend a lot of money on biomedical research, and almost everyone agrees it's money very well spent. In fact, the pharmaceutical industry is the biggest lobbyist for it. They lobby for it because they benefit from it. But in any case, no one would dispute that the research that the government funds through National Institutes of Health and other agencies is very, very productive, very, very useful. So we spend about 50 billion, again, somewhat more adding in the other agencies. The industry spends around 100 billion. So that's obviously more, but these are not, you know, orders of magnitude different. So my point, putting those two side by side, the idea that you could somehow replace the industry's funding, that shouldn't be absurd. I should just also throw in one other point, and I find a lot of people, when I'm saying people here, I mean economist type people, they have no idea. We spend over 500 billion a year on prescription drugs. So if you look at how much money the United States will be spending on prescription drugs in 2022, it's well over 500 billion. If we did not have patent monopolies, if we could sell all these drugs in a free market, we would almost certainly be spending less than 100 billion. So we have a lot of money to play with. The difference between 500 billion and 100 billion, of course, is $400 billion. That's the additional money that we're spending because of patent monopolies and related protections. So there's a lot of money out there that could, in principle, make up for the R&D that the industry spends. Now, again, I don't want to go into detail on this, but I'll just say, okay, well, what would be a good way to do that? My model here is long-term contracting, that the military does this to, their weapon systems, their latest planes. They do long-term contracting. They'll have a contract with a Lockheed, a Boeing, other companies. They typically subcontract. You have a prime contractor, they have subcontractors. I don't say this because I necessarily like what the military does, but just as a purely practical matter, we get good fighter planes, we get good tanks, they develop good weapon systems. No one really argues that. Do we pay too much for it? Arguably we do, but one huge advantage that you have with developing drugs as compared to military weapon systems, there's no reason it shouldn't be fully public. There's a very good argument, and again, they could exaggerate this, but there's a very good argument that we don't want to put our designs for our latest weapon systems up on the web where Al-Qaeda or whoever else could just download them and go, that's great. There's no good argument as to why you wouldn't put up all the research you're doing on cancer drugs or heart drugs. Great, someone else takes advantage of it and jumps ahead, fantastic. I mean, that's what we want. That's what we want science to do. We want it to advance rapidly. So again, I have no reason to go into great detail here, just pointing out, to my view, we have a very perverse mechanism for financing drugs. And that's what makes this expensive. It's not that, it's expensive to produce the drugs. It's not even that we're spending all that much on the research and development. As I say, it's around 100 billion that the industry spends. They charge 500 billion for the drugs. It's really that you create an enormous gap between what it costs to produce the drugs and what the drugs get sold for when you give them a patent monopoly. Okay, well, I mentioned that as background because how do we think about infectious diseases in this context? Well, again, infectious diseases are different in two very fundamental ways. One is that if one person gets the disease, it increases the likelihood someone else gets it. Again, I mean, this all seems very obvious, but we had these absurd arguments around mask requirements, vaccine requirements, like, oh, I get to do what I want. And you go, okay, that's fine. We'll stay off where you're not going to be in contact with anyone. Then you get to do what you want. But if you want to be able to go to stores and go to movies and, hear music or whatever, go to restaurants, well, you're threatening people. I remember this really annoyed me early on when they were imposing mask requirements. A lot of people were saying, oh, well, this is like a seatbelt requirement. It's a good thing to do. No, I think people should wear their seatbelts. But, I thought, no, that's the wrong analogy. I mean, the analogy is drunk driving laws. Seatbelts, to some extent, I mean, I understand the research, I'm not an expert on it, but you're staying in place increases your likelihood you'll control a car and less likely you'll hurt other people. But to my view, the more obvious comparison is drunk driving. We don't let you drive drunk. You could drink if you want. I mean, again, not a good idea for people to get really drunk or whatever, but that's, to some extent, we recognize that's your personal choice, however much we might discourage excessive drinking. And you could drive when you want, but you can't drink and drive, because you're threatening people. And that was the story with mask requirements, or more recently, the vaccine requirements. You get the disease, you're increasing the likelihood other people will get it. The other point, and again, an obvious one that really was driven home to us through in the pandemic, viruses mutate. So, the more the viruses spread, the more likely it is to mutate. And again, we had strange arguments. People were saying, oh, what's the likelihood that it'll mutate into something more infectious, more deadly? Well, if it's not more infectious, it's not going to be widely spread. I mean, and I'm sure there were all sorts of mutations that were not infectious and we never heard about them because no one got them. So a variant of Delta or Omicron or whatever that was not particularly infectious. Well, person who originally had the mutation, they got it, and maybe they gave it to someone else, but obviously it just won't spread widely. That's just that's just kind of common sense. But the more people that have an infection, they have a virus, the more likely it is to mutate. Again, I'm no expert on evolution and biology, but that's just kind of common sense. If you have something that 10 people have, not that much likelihood of it mutating. If you have something that 10 million people have, there's much greater likelihood of it mutating, just kind of common sense. Okay, so this is why we think about infectious diseases differently than we might think of cancer or heart disease. That I'm not going to get heart disease from someone else. I'm not going to get cancer, at least as far as we know. I've never heard a story that cancer, that there may be one cancer or something, I don't know. But generally we don't think of cancer as being something you can catch from someone else. It's not an infectious disease. Okay, so policies to deal with infectious disease. Well, again, it's long been recognized that infectious diseases do spread, and really you can go back to the Middle Ages when you had the bubonic plague. You probably go back further than that. I'm no expert on the history of this, but people understood that these diseases spread, and we have to take special measures to try and protect society from them. And these, if you want, you could say these infringe on individual liberties, because again, it's just like drunk driving. You're jeopardizing other people with your action. So what are the sorts of things we do? Public water and sewage systems. I mean, just go back to the 19th century that, you tax people to have public water systems, municipal water systems, municipal sewage systems. I mean, we could say this is individual responsibility. If you want clean water, dig a well or, put in a purification system. Which, again, some people do that. Some people do that even with the public systems, and that's fine, if they want to, ensure their water's a higher quality. But the whole point here was that we recognize that you get diseases that are spread through, contaminated water and through sewage systems. And, again, that's just kind of common sense. And, very early on, we go back to the 19th century. I actually, my father-in-law, who was an astronomer, he told my wife and I about this. We were visiting Paris, and he goes, "You have to go see the Paris sewer systems." And we thought he was originally joking, and he wasn't. And he was absolutely right, because they actually do have kind of, I don't know if museum's the right word, but they at one of their sewage locations, they have like a history of the Paris sewage systems. And again, it sounds kind of crude and everything, but it's very much common sense, because when you had an outbreak of some sort of disease, cholera or bubonic plague, I don't know if they had plague ever in Paris, they probably did. If you didn't have a good sewage system, you'd get people dying in mass, and that of course happened. So designing an effective sewage system was really integral to Paris's growth as a major city. I'm sure for other cities as well, but I mean, Paris, of course, was one of the largest cities in Europe, still is. But I mean, it was one of the largest cities. You can go back 400, 500, 600 years, and one of the reasons why is that they did design an effective sewage system so that people wouldn't get contaminated. They wouldn't contaminate others when they got sick, and it really is a remarkable development. So if anyone's in Paris, lots of really beautiful things to see in Paris, but it's I wish I could tell you exactly where it was. I can't really remember, but it's near the southern city, so it wouldn't be hard to find, I'm sure anyone's interested. Vaccine mandates, again, same principle, and this goes back we had these in the Revolutionary War, where George Washington required his soldiers be vaccinated against smallpox. And again, it wasn't he wanted to tell them what to do. It was, if one soldier got smallpox, it increased the likelihood that other soldiers would. So they had access to the smallpox vaccine, and they mandated that their soldiers get vaccinated against smallpox. So again, it's we're not, it's big government, we're going to put a shot in your arm. Well, yeah, you can call it that, because if you get smallpox, you're going to jeopardize the health of everyone around you. And of course, this continues today, that we have all sorts of vaccines that are mandated for kids when they go to school, measles, smallpox, still any number of other vaccines that are mandated for kids to go to school, polio, of course. And again, the logic was that is that if someone catches the disease, it increases the likelihood that others will get it. I'm thankfully, I guess, a little bit too young to have had to worry about polio, but my mother wasn't. And, she had the story when they first developed the polio vaccine. It was like this huge thing that, they would have trucks that would they'd get the kids in the neighborhood, and everyone would go and get the vaccine. It was this huge thing, that okay, everyone's now going to be protected from polio, because prior to that, of course, you had to worry in the summer. Kids would go swimming, and you'd have outbreaks of polio and kids could be paralyzed for life, some even die. And so anyhow, the logic of a vaccine and, in many cases having mandates of it, that's pretty straightforward. Now, we don't do that with everything. We did do it, to some extent, obviously, with the COVID vaccines, but, say with the flu vaccine, as far as I know, no one has mandated that. And the logic there, again, people could argue, I'm not a medical professional, but people would argue that the risk is not so great that it merits require people doing it. So we might think it's a good idea for people to get a flu vaccine every year. I think it's a good idea, but if for whatever reason someone doesn't want to do it, we don't mandate it. But when you talk about a disease that has more serious consequences, as we know polio does, as we know COVID does, then you might say, okay, we're going to mandate it because you're posing a threat to other people. Again, if you want to go off and live by yourself in the woods, I don't think anyone's going to come and require you to get a polio vaccine if you don't want it, or a COVID vaccine, of course. But the whole issue is that people generally don't live off in the woods; they're coming into contact with other people. The last point, of course, we haven't done this in the U.S. They are doing this in other countries, in China. And we've done this in other contexts where we quarantine affected individuals. And again, that's obviously a gross infringement on people's rights. People can't go where they want. I don't know if people have been following it now in China, but their zero COVID policy, they've locked down the city of Shanghai, which is 25 million people. Think of, 3 New Yorks. I mean, a huge, huge city. And they've locked down, the huge number of people in their homes. They have very limited ability to leave. They bring them food, apparently not enough, not always the medications they need. I mentioned it's probably a bad example of quarantining, but in other cases, typhoid, people got typhoid in the early part of the 20th century. They were often quarantined. They were required to, be separated from society so they wouldn't spread the disease. Again, it's not a pleasant thing. It's not the sort of thing you want to do, but it's, again, a recognition of the fact that my being sick increases the probability of other people being sick. And in a case like typhoid, cholera, early in the 20th century, where you didn't have effective treatments, that was a reasonable policy. Again, you could argue whether it was the best thing to do. They could have done other things. Were they too, extensive? I'm not in a position to judge that. But you're in a situation where basically a sick person who had gotten cholera, person who had gotten typhoid, they posed a direct threat to everyone around them. And that was the logic of quarantining them. So again, that's certainly not a desirable policy. You don't ever want to be in that situation. But, we have done that in the past. We did sort of do that in this, and that we, I don't know of anyone who was legally required to quarantine, but we certainly encourage people. I know I got infected back in the early fall last year, and I didn't want my wife to get sick, so we were able to separate our house. We're lucky enough to be in a big enough place that I had a couple rooms to myself. She had the rest of her house to her, and she'd bring me food and water or whatever, and so the logic of quarantining is straightforward. The whether you mandate it, you require people, it is an extreme measure. You generally don't want to do it, of course, but you could envision, you could at least understand where you have an infectious disease, a highly infectious disease, where you don't have good treatments, then it may well make sense to require quarantines of individuals. Okay, so a little bit about the current pandemic. One of the things that comes out of this, at least to me, is the need for worldwide vaccination. To my mind, it was just absolutely crazy that we didn't make that a top priority. Meaning we, the U.S. government, the governments of other wealthy nations. This wasn't a case of handouts, and I really wouldn't be opposed to handouts that would protect people in poor countries from the coronavirus. But it was just, we had a very concrete interest here. We wanted to stem the spread of the pandemic. And I really don't understand, why this wasn't like an absolute priority from the first day when we recognized we had this massive worldwide pandemic. It's inexplicable to me why we didn't place a huge priority on immediately vaccinating the world And just to be clear what this would have meant, at least to my view, I mean, I would have loved to have seen them share all the data, all the research on, and all the vaccines. So we have to, people often talk about the vaccine, and it kind of drives me nuts because we have 2 mRNA vaccines. We have the Johnson & Johnson's, a quite different type of vaccines. It's an AstraZeneca vaccine, very effective vaccine that was developed at Oxford University and AstraZeneca. There's China has 2 vaccines that were developed. There's a new vaccine that was developed by Dr. Peter Hortez in Texas that apparently is very effective. So there's a variety of vaccines. What would have been most desirable, in my view, and just seems kind of common sense, you will want to share the information for the technology, share all the research findings, how effective they are. Are they, one of the issues is one might be more effective for some people than others. So we know people in different health conditions, different ages. Some people take medications that may interact badly with the vaccine. So there's issues about that, and those are very real. But in principle, we will want to share those and share the production technology. I've been on debates with people and they go, oh, well, Moderna, Pfizer, these are all industrial secrets. You go, well, unsecret them, share the information. And people say, how would you do that? Well, one, we sometimes force people. I mean, governments, when there have been antitrust issues, they have sometimes forced companies to disclose information, when it's considered in violation of antitrust. But the other thing you just do is the knowledge inheres with people. So you have engineers at Pfizer, at Merck, at the other companies, and you just say, well, we're going to pay them to share their information. And of course, they're all bound by non-disclosure agreements, so they'd all be sued. So we just go, that's fine, go ahead and sue. We'll pay their damages, we'll pay their legal fees. And my guess is probably just about all of them would be happy to take the money and share the information, because probably most of them care about getting the world vaccinated. They probably think what they're doing is good, which it is. So they'd be happy to share it. And if they can make money on it and don't have to worry about being sued because the government will cover their costs, no issue. So this was not an insoluble problem. So, I mean, to my view, what I would have liked to have seen was, as we were testing the vaccines, as the phase 3 testing was going through, so that the Food and Drug Administrations would approve that, as well as the other regulatory agencies around the world, we could have been producing large stockpiles. And the we is anyone in the world. We have vaccine manufacturers all over the world. India is actually the largest manufacturer. They could have been producing stockpiles of it, so that by the time one of these vaccines was approved, we had 1 billion, maybe 2 billion doses sitting around ready to be distributed. And, again, I've had people say, well, if it turned out to be ineffective, so what? So it costs around $1, maybe $1.50 at most to produce these vaccines. If they end up being ineffective, you throw them in the garbage. I mean, what's you try to think about the cost of that. You go, okay, so we had to waste $1 billion, maybe 2 of the vaccines proved to be ineffective. The record was actually pretty good, but whatever, let's say that 2 or 3 of them end up being ineffective. You threw out $2 or $3 or $4 billion, you could have saved millions of lives. It's not even close. And of course, money-wise too, because, we had the shutdowns, when you had the outbreaks, obviously the original one, but later with the Delta, the other variants, those led to widespread shutdowns. So this should not have even been a close call, but in any case, that's not what we did. Instead, we're concerned about protecting the monopolies, the patent monopolies of Pfizer, Moderna. Forbes said that, as of last summer, and it's probably more now, but as of last summer, they identified 5 Moderna billionaires. So 5 people who've become billionaires as a result of their holdings of Moderna stock. I should also point out, I like to pick on Moderna. I think it's appropriate. The U.S. government was hugely responsible for the developing of mRNA technology, in general. So the research on it dating back to the early 80s, that was funded almost entirely by public funds. But then also when Moderna came to develop their COVID vaccine, we paid them about $440 million to develop the vaccine. And then we paid for the phase 3 testing, which was, I think also is about $450 million. That's not an exact sum, but that's a ballpark number. So they took zero risk. I mean, you often hear the story that, the drug companies spend, billions on research and they take all this risk because very often, the drugs don't turn out. Well, in this case, there was zero risk. If if at the end of it they'd done their phase 3 trials, they brought the evidence to the FDA, and the FDA goes, well, it's not very effective, we're not gonna approve it. They weren't out any money, they got paid. So anyhow, it's just kind of striking. As I say, I think what we did was absolutely horrible there. The need on testing and treatment. So again, you found, and I guess we'll see where this ends up. The World Trade Organization's been debating a waiver for the pandemic, and they've been delaying it forever, so it's almost moot. But it was only going to apply to vaccines, whereas the original proposal, it came from India and South Africa, would have also applied for testing and treatment. Well, in the case of infectious diseases, apart from just the general issue, I mean, we might think it's good that people in poor countries could get tested, could get treated. But the whole point here is that we want to limit the spread. So if you could test, you could treat, then that makes it more likely you'll be able to control the spread. Testing, obviously, if people know they have it, then they could be quarantined, again, of their own volition. Maybe someone will. China obviously does, but require quarantines. But it will limit the spread. And treatment, to my view, goes with testing, because it's hard to get people to get tested if they can't get treated anyhow. I mean, particularly in a developing country where it's not just a question of going down the street to your pharmacy and getting a test. It might be a very, costly and time-consuming process to go to a city if you're living in the countryside and getting tested. If you can't get treated for it anyhow, you're probably going to be more reluctant to be tested. So really, to my view, those go together. And again, just to be very concrete here, we started out with the original alpha strain back in, first diagnosed in Wuhan in the end of 2019, December of 2019. That was what we were dealing with pretty much all through 2020. And then we had the Delta strain develop in India in I think it was March of 2021, if I remember correctly. That became, in many ways more serious. I haven't seen the exact numbers. I'm sure they're available, but I haven't checked the exact numbers. But in any case, a more serious threat than the alpha strain. At least it was much more resistant to the vaccines. Now, if you had widespread vaccination from the very beginning, so if the vaccines were first approved in December of 2020, if at that point we had billions of doses that we could begin to distribute, we might have been able to prevent the Delta variant from ever coming into existence. I mean, if you had been able to give millions of doses, or hundreds of millions, I should say, not millions, hundreds of millions to people in India in January, February of 2020, it's possible we would have prevented the Delta strain from ever having developed. Then, of course, we got the Omicron strain developed in November. I guess that was when the first cases were identified in South Africa. We almost certainly could have prevented the Omicron strain. We would have vaccinated the world by that point. So, again, just think of what the benefits would have been, obviously for people in the developing world, but for the whole world, if we could have quickly gotten the vaccines out and gotten most of the world vaccinated, certainly by the end of 2021. And clearly, at this point, it should be a non-issue. I mean, there's no reason we could not get everyone vaccinated. So again, this just speaks to the logic of infectious diseases. You want to limit the spread, and we all benefit from it. So it's, again, I think most of us would probably say we don't want to see people in poor countries get these diseases, suffer from them just because they're poor. But beyond that, this is unique to infectious diseases. We will all benefit if we could limit the spread, limit the likelihood that we'll get mutations, and we again will be hit with another round of another episode of the pandemic. Okay, so just to again make the main points. We should look to get vaccines everywhere. One of the good stories, well, mixed story. There aren't enough vaccines now for the world. I mean, I guess this is, I made reference to the WTO measure pushed by South Africa and India, that they originally proposed that in November of 2020. We're a long way down the road. What happened was, I put it basically that the rich countries filibustered. I mean, I was very happy that the Biden administration sort of lent its support to it back in April of last year. I don't think we ever pushed that hard because the United States obviously carries a lot of weight in the WTO and everywhere. The European countries basically said, well, there's this, there's that, there's that, there's that. And now there's a compromise, and I have to say, I haven't even followed it because, I mean, I followed it a little bit. It just seems like it matters so little, you know, because again, we have the vaccines. So the original idea was that you would suspend patent and other intellectual property rules on vaccines, on treatments, on tests for the duration of the pandemic. And that would have allowed them to be produced everywhere. That would have mattered if that got approved in November of 2020, or even 3, 4, 5 months, 6 months later. There are startup times, there's no doubt about that. So you can't start producing the vaccine the next day. But at this point, it is moot. We have enough vaccines that we could vaccinate the whole world. There is an issue that, you know, and this is an important one, that in many poorer countries, they don't have the distribution mechanisms in place. And this is, again, one of the things the drug companies, I think it was very cynical, but they made a big point of saying, oh, well, they can have the vaccines, they won't be able to get them out. Well, they're not going to set up a distribution system for the vaccines unless they have the vaccine. So it's a chicken egg story. They now have the vaccine. So the focus, you know, we as rich countries should be acting to try to ensure that they can distribute them, get them in rural areas. One of the issues with the mRNA vaccines, particularly the Pfizer vaccine, it requires super cold storage. So you have to make sure that, you know, if you're using the Pfizer vaccine, you can use the other vaccines as well, obviously, but if you're using it, that you have the storage boxes, that you have portable freezers that could maintain the super cold temperatures. It has to be minus, I think it's 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that just gives you an idea. I mean, it's not your normal freezer that would do the trick here. Tests and treatments, again, we want to slow the spread. So that means, you know, letting people know when they have it so that they can take steps to quarantine themselves, avoid giving it to their family members, friends. Again, this has been neglected in the sense that even where you have this compromise, and who knows whether it'll ever get through the WTO, it's just about vaccines. And, you know, again, to my view, you know, you wanted all three to go together. You wanted tests, you wanted treatments. It wasn't just, oh, we'll give you a vaccine so you don't catch it. We also want people to take the tests so that they could quarantine themselves. You know, again, one of the stories that we know with the vaccines, and it's turned increasingly true with, you know, the new variants, that they don't actually protect you from getting it. So the Omicron variant, my wife's Danish, so we've been following the numbers in Denmark. Absolutely crazy numbers of people were getting Omicron. So you go back, it's down now, but if you go back to January and February, they were peaking at 50, even 60,000 cases a day. And to give you an idea, they've got a population in Denmark, I think it's about 5.8 million. So multiply that by about 60. So, you know, 60 times 60,000, you'd be talking about 3.6 million cases a day. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. That was a peak, and it's not quite 60, but whatever. You'd be talking about over 3 million cases a day in the United States. Well, my reason for focusing on that is they all are vaccinated. It's about the most vaccinated country in the world. People are boosted too. So it didn't protect people from getting the disease. What it did do was protect people from getting seriously ill and dying. I mean, they still, a number of people did get ill and die, but, you know, nothing remotely like what you would expect with that level of infection. So this, again, speaks to the importance of having tests, having treatments, so that, you know, people will get infected, but if they know they're infected, they could try to prevent getting their family members infected, getting their friends infected, and spread it throughout the community. And the last point that, you know, again, this is why I went through the economics of drug development. It is cheap, you know, so, you know, we are charging, I don't even know, I think they're charging more for the boosters, but we're paying $20 a shot for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. That's a rough number. It might be a little higher, a little lower, but rough number for the vaccines. Well, that makes it more expensive, but what it actually costs to produce them, what does it cost to manufacture the Pfizer vaccine, bring it to you to you know, medical center, pharmacy, whatever it is, to get it in your arm? That was about $1.50. Okay, so, you know, to my view, the cost of successfully treating this pandemic or any sort of infectious disease are so trivial relative to the benefit, it really shouldn't be an arguable point. And, you know, again, I just think we had a lot of unnecessary suffering, unnecessary death, because we didn't think about this clearly, and hopefully we'll do a better job the next time, I guess I'll say. So we have some time for questions. I'm happy to hear questions, comments, criticisms.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Baker. We have been listening to Dean Baker, co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and a visiting professor at the University of Utah, discussing the economics of infectious diseases. I will soon open the floor to questions, and please limit yourself to questions, no comments, please. A recording of this session will be broadcasted following Thursday noon on 90.1 FM KKFI.org, Kansas City Community Radio, probably 11 days from now, April 28th. We will turn off that recording at 11 a.m. Dean has graciously agreed to stay a few minutes after 11 and participate in a more open discussion for questions and comments people may not want broadcasted on KKFI. First, however, I wish to invite our audience to consider donating to the forum. To do that, you can go to allsoulskc.org, search for contribute, then click giving at the bottom of the page, then donate now. Our Zoom audience should be able to find a link for that in the chat right now. I just dropped it in the chat. In either case, below the amount you may wish to change quote, give to All Souls operating budget to give to forum. Now, for those of you who have questions, please click the reactions icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then select raise hand. You can also drop your questions in the chat and hope that I will see them there. And I don't see any questions yet. But I have one. Talk to us about the role of the media in maintaining current public policies regarding patents and public health, Professor Baker.
Well, the media, I went through this discussion at the onset about the cost of producing drugs versus what's charged. That's an issue that's very rarely ever discussed in the media at all. So, they often treat it as like a given that drugs are expensive, that vaccines are expensive. And again, the fact that there's this enormous gap between the price and cost, it's really not a debatable point, but I think very few people are aware of that. That's why, I say when I give these talks, I'll often start out drugs are cheap, and then people think I'm crazy. It's something that, you very, very rarely seen mentioned in the media. And it's been, funny is probably not the right word, but the treatment of the development of the vaccines, I remember early on, there were reports that China was spying, and they were trying to, they were trying to, according to the reports, I have no idea what's true, but according to reports that were attributed to intelligence sources, they were spying, I guess, on Moderna, maybe Pfizer too, I don't know, but they were trying to get the vaccine. That was the story. Whether that happened or not, I have no idea. And this is true. This is really sinister thing. Well, on the one hand, yeah, you don't want that going on, but on the other hand, you go, oh, wouldn't that be awful? They might get the vaccine and be able to give it to their people. I mean, it was, no one made that point. I mean, that seems that would just jump right out at you. I mean, I understand, if they were developing a new, fighter bomber and they're going to get that and they'll be able to use that as a weapon, okay, I understand that. That's, I'd say a bad thing. But what's the bad story here? And no one ever said that. It was just really like, oh my God, those nasty Chinese, they're trying to get a vaccine that they would be able to give their people, and they might give it to the rest of the world. I mean, it just bizarre. So they never asked what, to my view, were very basic questions like, is this really the best way for us to develop drugs, to develop vaccines? Is this really what we should be doing? That literally never gets asked. And it's one of these things that I don't have that much hair left, but I pull my hair out. Like, I read the Times religiously, I read the Washington Post religiously, I occasionally read the Atlantic, the New Yorker. Literally, I've never seen a piece in decades that said, can we have an alternative mechanism for financing prescription drug research? And, they do explore, what we might think of as far out topics, so you could read in there. I mean, there's a lot of talk about basic income. Not that I think that's a bad thing, but it's, politically, I don't think we're going to see it anytime soon. So basic income, people, I'm sure, are familiar with the concept. Everyone gets, $1,500 a month, $1,000 a month or something. Again, you could argue the merits of it, but politically, that's not a plausible story. I just mentioned all sorts of things like that you'll find over time in these publications that are clearly far out politically. This is an idea that, again, we already finance research. So the idea that we would spend more money on research and then have things available as generics from day one, that shouldn't be so crazy that no one would explore it. But literally, it is never mentioned. And certainly in the case of the pandemic, it was treated like, oh, this horrible thing. China might get the vaccine and, produce large numbers and vaccinate people.
Craig Voland has a question.
Hey,
Yeah,
before
thank
we
you.
jump into that, can we get Mr. Baker to stop sharing his screen so that the visual is
sure.
clear? Thank you.
Sorry.
You had mentioned that there was $500 billion in revenue by big pharma. And then you mentioned there's 50 billion from the research that essentially subsidizes it. That's NIH. And then you talked about the patent policy, which is essentially a subsidy for that.
Yeah.
What about all the money that Medicare and Medicaid spends to support people's drug expenses? Isn't that an additional subsidy?
Well, it's a really good question. It's also something that has a lot to say in the economics. So that's included in the 500 plus billion, whatever the exact number might be. So what Medicare and Medicaid pay is part of that 500 billion in revenue that the industry will collect this year. Now, the reason why I say it's an important point, if we talk about most items, it's kind of classic economist argument. There's something to that. I mean, I think there's a lot to it. Sweater I'm wearing, I know how much it's worth to me. It's worth $30 or whatever. And if they charge 40, I won't buy it. 20, I'll be happy. Whatever. So there's this idea of consumer sovereignty that here we are deciding how much things are worth for it. And we know better. I know better how much this sweater is worth to me than the government does. So the government's not going to decide what I should pay for the sweater. We think that was a bad thing if it did. Price controls. That we generally think that's a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing in general. Okay, but with prescription drugs, generally the person buying it is not the person paying for it. So in addition, I mean, I think most of us think of health differently than the sweater, so there's that. But apart from that, I'm not the one paying for the drug, in the vast majority of cases. It's either the government or it's an insurer. So it's a third party payer. So we don't even have this idea that, I'm determining how much it's worth to me. The government's going to determine it. The government's going to make a decision, is Medicare prepared to pay for this drug? There was a very expensive Alzheimer's drug of questionable effectiveness, Adahan, that just got approved by the FDA last summer. And Medicare decided it won't pay for it under most circumstances. So it's not even a case of, the individual deciding, okay, how much is this drug worth to me? And again, I think all of us would think that's a rather perverse way to think about things. Here's a cancer drug, might extend my life for 5 years. How much am I willing to pay for that? I mean, we usually don't think we should be making decisions on those grounds. But in any case, it's not even the individual. It's the drug, it's the government, or even where it's an insurer, it's again a third party. And oftentimes we get the government to force insurers that, okay, you provide insurance, you have to cover this drug. So anyhow, so that's a longer answer to a question you didn't exactly ask, but what Medicare and Medicaid pay is included in that 500 billion. And I guess one more sidebar on that it is, this is again, very much a political question because, again, taking the Alzheimer's drug, they were obviously lobbying to get Medicare to pay for it, which again, they decided not to. Medicaid, of course, is administered at the state level. So you have 51 different Medicaid agencies. And what you find is that in many cases where drug companies have expensive drugs, they're lobbying at the state level to say, oh, the Medicaid should pay for this drug. So there've been instances that I remember there was an Eli Lilly, I'm forgetting what the drug was exactly, some years ago. But in any case, there was a generic on the market that most professionals and most medical researchers thought was every bit as good as the brand drug. But they got Medicaid to continue to pay for the brand drug that cost like 10 times as much, basically by lobbying, being effective lobbyists, and wasted a huge amount of money that way. Again, not my assessment, the assessment of medical researchers who thought the generic was every bit as good.
Renee Price, do you have a question?
Go.
It's actually me, Spencer. To what extent do you feel that racism, racial issues goes into healthcare policy and affects the way we think about policy regarding alternatives to the current system that might lower the price of prescription drugs?
Well, it obviously factors in a lot of different ways. I mean, one of the things is that, we meaning like the elite media. So I don't know if I belong in that but the New York Times, other major media outlets, they tend to treat something as being much more serious if it affects particularly a white upper middle class population than if it affects, primarily affects, lower income Black and Hispanic people, and other people of color. And that's a longstanding phenomenon, and it's, so that affects, what diseases are treated as priorities. For a long time, AIDS wasn't treated as a serious priority because, well, on the one hand, gays were the people who were getting it, and also drug users, disproportionately people of color. So if you could stigmatize, a disease, addiction to a population that's considered, racially inferior, whatever, then it's taken less seriously. And of course, in terms of the developing world, diseases that affect millions of people, tens of millions of people, get very little research funding because they're just not a priority. They don't have a lot of money, and they're the suffering of those people, their deaths and illness just isn't given the same priority as, say, upper middle class white people. So it's there's a lot of different ways in which it comes into our healthcare system. I'm certainly no expert to be able to talk about all of them, but I mean some of them are pretty easy to see, in terms of the priorities of healthcare and what's viewed as a serious problem.
Susan Sarachek is with me. She asked, what about AIDS?
Well, AIDS is an example where, again, it wasn't taken seriously. There actually is a very good AIDS story that I don't know how widely known it is. I don't know if I should say good AIDS, but Africa, sub-Saharan Africa was, of course, hit with a horrible pandemic of AIDS back in the early and mid 90s, well, throughout the 90s. And this was the period when, of course, we developed the triple cocktails, which, were very effective in, basically making the chronic disease that, we had previously developed AZT in the 80s, which delayed the development of AIDS, so people could take AZT and in many cases live for years, relatively normal lives. But it didn't stop it, and people usually did ultimately die. So it was way better than what we had previously. But again, it didn't allow people to live normal lives indefinitely. The triple cocktails that were developed in the early mid 90s did do that. They allowed people to basically live normal lives, be a chronic disease. We've developed better ones, of course, in the intervening quarter century, 30 years. But this was tremendously important development. Well, at that time we were selling them for 10 to 15,000, for a year's treatment in the United States. And you had this massive outbreak in sub-Saharan Africa, and drug companies were just shrugging their shoulders, saying, "Well, we can't, we'd sell it there, but people can't spend 10 to 15,000." And they were literally saying that's what it cost them to produce the drug. Because again, they spent money. This gets back to the point I was making earlier. They did spend money researching the drug. No one disputes that. But you already had done the research. So we aren't asking you to do the research again. We're asking, how much does it cost now that you've developed these drugs? How much does it cost to, manufacture them and get them around to, people in sub-Saharan Africa? And they were saying, oh, 10 to 15,000, which of course, absolutely absurd price tag, certainly for people in sub-Saharan Africa. Their per capita income was under 1,000. So there's no way you could treat a lot of people with the triple cocktails at 10 to 15,000. Anyhow, the great part of the story, there were a number of people. One of the people I know, Jamie Love, was a great guy. He's done work on this stuff for decades. He got in touch with this, I should remember his name. He was the person, I think he's still around, who heads Cipla, which is the largest generic manufacturer in India. And he was talking to him, he goes, I can make these, they're a huge manufacturer that produce top quality drugs. And he said, I could sell these profitably for $200 to $300 for a year's treatment. So, there's nothing, let's say there's nothing more compelling than facts on the ground. So we could argue how much it costs to produce it, and as long as, Pfizer and the other big manufacturers were the only ones producing it, they could tell you 10 or 15,000. We could say that doesn't make sense. But when you have a major manufacturer in India going, I could sell them for $200 or $300 and make a profit. I think the guy's committed to helping people too, but he's also a businessman. Then you couldn't argue. And that basically got the World's AIDS Fund going, because they convinced Kofi Annan, he was the head of the UN at the time, yeah, we should do this. We should look to, because at $200 or $300, that's a very realistic thing for AIDS organizations, international aid, that they could treat people, they could afford that $200 or $300. So even $200 or $300, of course, is expensive for very poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but that's a reasonable commitment from the international aid community. And to his credit, I'm not a big fan of George W. Bush, but I remember he kicked in, I think it was like $3 billion. I forget the exact sum. And I was originally really cynical. And then a friend of mine, I think it might have been Jamie Love, he said, no, this is real. They're putting up the money. And to their credit, the Gates Foundation actually put in money too, because they were originally backing the pharmaceutical industry to the hilt. They've generally not been good actors, to my view, in international health, but public health. But in any case, they did kick in some money. And as a result of that, probably most people in sub-Saharan Africa now who have AIDS are able to get the treatment, and they've managed to contain it. So that actually is a good story at the end of the day. Millions of people died, and that's certainly not a good story. But, as a result of, really kind of heroic efforts by, certainly some of the activists who were able to call attention to the problem, and certainly Cipla, the Indian drug manufacturer, they were able to save, probably tens of millions of lives.
What about masking in general practices regarding wearing face masks in Japan?
That's, the Japanese culture, and I think to a lesser extent other Asian cultures, that people often wear masks. First time I was in Korea, I sort of struck by that. That's probably a good thing. I don't know that we would get people, given the resistance to wearing masks, even in the middle of a pandemic, but, there's, during flu season, people were saying, oh, well, people die from the flu. Well, we should have fewer people dying from the flu, but I don't know that we'll get a situation where we have mask wearing. But I will say, if we could just get more of a conscious, I've been guilty of this myself. If you're not feeling well, don't do anyone favors, don't go to work, don't get on a bus. I remember I was once on a bus in DC and I was coughing, and I realized I just had something in my throat, but I knew people didn't know that. So I just got off the bus, stopped coughing, and then got the next one. But, just a little common sense, we should be more mindful of that we're spreading disease. And even if no one's going to die of it, people don't need to get your cold or your flu.
Okay, so we're about out of time. Any final comments, Dr. Baker?
Well, I really appreciate the chance to talk with people. I hope it's worthwhile. I always like to blab on this stuff because it's some extent a sidebar for me, but it's a very important one. And, again, I just think there's a lot of confusion around this that I just wish we could get people think more clearly. And obviously it has huge implications for people's lives, people's health. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with people.
Great. All right, I wish to thank our audience for joining this episode of All Souls Forum. Dean Baker has been discussing the economics of infectious diseases. Tune in next week to hear Richard Thompson discussing sissiphobia.